As the colonial era drew to a close, the Soviet Union believed the world would turn to socialism and preached that message in its propaganda. The United States was concerned.
The feeling was very strong in Washington that the Soviets were pursuing a policy of expansion into the third world. And our objective was to prevent that.
Nikita Khrushchev and Gamal Abdel Nasser changed the face of Egypt. After the West had refused a loan for a dam across the Nile, the Soviet Union took over. The emerging nations used the Cold War to get money and arms. The developing world was being courted.
В Европе уже границы закоченели, они были забетонированы.
In Europe, the borders were set in stone, and there was no opportunity of expansion there for either side. It would have started a new world war. Where could the hunting take place? To be rather crude, in those areas where there was still prey. That was the third world. And each side tried not to miss a chance.
Старалась не упустить случай.
In the Horn of Africa, the Soviet Union backed two rival and opposed regimes. For America, this was evidence of Soviet expansion. In Angola, thousands of Cubans poured in to fight South African troops backed by the United States. In Egypt, the Soviet Union supplied arms cheaply and on credit. But President Nasser wasn't easily influenced.
One shouldn't think of our relations with Nasser as the relations of master and servant. Nasser always pursued his own policy.
He was able to understand the global strategy, and now we can benefit from the disagreement between the Soviet Union and between the United States and the West, and make benefit of this situation to raise our capabilities militarily and economically.
Nasser was the hero of the Arab world. The Egyptians rallied for war. Nasser and the Arab states wanted to destroy Israel. Moscow did not. In 1948, the Soviet Union had supported the creation of the State of Israel on Arab lands. By 1967, Israel's 2.5 million Jews were surrounded by 90 million hostile Arabs. Israel felt insecure. The threat from Egypt became intense. Israel had America's political backing, but not her weapons. Would Israel get America's support for a surprise attack?
President Johnson asked us to bring Israel's foreign minister to the family quarters of the White House, and to speak rather crudely about it, the intent was to work him over, to persuade him is perhaps a more polite term, to avoid a preemptive attack. We thought we had persuaded him.
Israel struck first. In less than 3 hours, 90% of the Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the ground. The Israelis seized East Jerusalem. Jews were able to pray at the Wailing Wall again. The Israelis pressed on. Within 6 days, the armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan were routed. The map of the Middle East was transformed. Israel had trebled its size.
In the contest between Russia and America, in the Cold War in the Middle East, Israel was an automatic ally of the West. Since the Six-Day War, this automatic ally became a strategic asset.
America became Israel's principal source of arms. In the occupied territories, 1 million Arabs fell under Israeli rule. It was a devastating blow to Arab morale. The Soviets counted the cost.
Как бы наше оружие оказалось не столь эффективным, как
our weapons turned out to be less effective than we calculated.
хотя бы, так сказать, возместить.
We felt that it was our duty to compensate, to supply more arms.
Опять же, поставить оружие и
and looking at the wider context, not to let the West win.
Не дать выигрыша Западу.
September 1970, grief in Egypt at the death of President Gamal Abdel Nasser. The developing world mourned an outstanding leader. So did Soviet Prime Minister Kosygin. The mourners were uneasy, as were the Russians. Who could follow Nasser?
I shall do my best to follow the policy of my late president, my dearest friend, President Gamal. But no one will capitulate here in this country. I am not ready to capitulate or to surrender 1 inch or a bit of sand.
At the Moscow summit of 1972, the superpowers agreed on a code of conduct, détente. Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev agreed not to seek advantage at the other's expense. Better ties with America outweighed Moscow's commitments to the Arabs.
This angered Sadat because he felt that they were giving priority to détente with the Americans rather than helping Egypt wage a war.
But détente didn't stop American efforts to extend its influence in the Middle East at Moscow's expense.
Our policy in '72 was really to try to minimize and reduce the role. I'll go further, to keep the Soviets out of the situation.
We established the policy then that we would thwart any move backed by Soviet arms until some Arab leader would become so frustrated that he would turn to us for diplomacy, and then we would try to take as even-handed a position as we were capable of developing.
In Egypt, as in many other developing nations, the Soviet presence was huge. In July 1972, Sadat told the 15,000 advisors and their families to pack up and go. It was a bold power play. Sadat's move boosted his popularity and showed how little control the Russians really had.
By October '72, they decided to come back to the support of Egypt. And then Sadat make benefit from that. He says, well, I expel them to express power so that they would give us what we need. And strange enough, we had arms deal after the October, which was one of the biggest arms deal we've got with the Soviet Union.
Sadat needed the arms. He was planning to end the uneasy peace.
He wanted to go to war. He needed to go to war. He felt he couldn't do otherwise. He considered that negotiations were impossible without some heating of the whole process. I mean, some shock therapy.
Yom Kippur, Israel's most holy day. 4,000 Egyptian troops and tanks surged over the Suez Canal.
لحظة